"She smells like medicine," my son Brandon said. And then he laughed, a sound that cut through my soul like broken glass. There's something that dies inside a mother's heart when her own child mocks her existence. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I would share. And if you, for even a second, feel that this sounds familiar, I just ask that you leave a like and subscribe, because this story might help someone draw closer to God's love. Amen. My name is Elaine Thompson. I'm 69 years old, a widow, a believer, and apparently, according to my only son, a woman who smells like medicine. I live in a small blue house in Toledo, Ohio, the same house where I raised Brandon, where I buried my husband Harold after 10 brutal years of cancer treatments, and where I now spend my mornings reading scripture at a kitchen table that feels too big for one person. The fluorescent light above the sink flickers sometimes, casting shadows across the photographs on my refrigerator, pictures of Brandon's childhood, his wedding to Amanda, Christmas mornings when my house still filled with laughter instead of the hollow echo of my own footsteps. My hands shake slightly as I pour my morning coffee, arthritis making simple tasks feel monumental. But I manage. I always manage. I was folding laundry in the hallway that Tuesday afternoon when I heard them. Brandon and Amanda stood by my refrigerator, whispering, but not quietly enough for a woman whose hearing had grown sharp from years of listening for Harold's labored breathing in the night. Years of waiting for calls from doctors with test results that only got worse. "She always smells like ointment and pills," Amanda added to Brandon's cruel observation, her voice carrying the casual cruelty of someone discussing the weather, like one of those nursing homes where people go to, you know. My hands froze on Brandon's old church sweater, the navy blue cardigan I'd knitted him when he was 12, back when he still hugged me after Sunday service and asked me to make my special chocolate chip cookies for his school friends. The wool felt soft between my fingers, worn thin from years of washing and wearing, just like the woman holding it. Then Brandon, my miracle baby, the child God gave me after 2 miscarriages and endless nights of prayer, the boy I nursed through fevers and nightmares and teenage heartbreak, laughed harder than I'd heard him laugh in years. "Well, she is practically a relic," he said, his voice carrying the confidence of a man who'd never spent 10 years watching his father waste away, never held a dying husband's hand while praying for just one more day together. "She'll probably forget who we are by next year," Amanda whispered, and their shared laughter echoed through my kitchen like a death knell, bouncing off the same walls where I'd hung Brandon's childhood artwork, where I'd celebrated his graduation, where I'd hosted his rehearsal dinner just 3 years ago. I didn't confront them. I didn't scream or cry or demand an explanation. Instead, I walked quietly back to the laundry room, closed the door with the gentle click of someone who'd learned to move through the world without making noise, and dropped to my knees on the cold linoleum floor. The tears came like a flood, not the dignified weeping of a mature Christian woman, but the raw, broken sobs of a little girl who'd just discovered that the person she loved most in the world saw her as nothing more than an inconvenience. My rosary lay on the folding table beside me, its worn wooden beads catching the afternoon light that filtered through the small basement window, and I reached for it with hands that trembled not from age, but from heartbreak. "Lord Jesus," I whispered between sobs, my voice barely audible even to myself. "Why does it hurt so much to be forgotten by the one I gave everything to? I raised him with love, with scripture, with every ounce of strength you gave me. Where did I go wrong?" The silence that followed felt infinite, stretching through the small room like an accusation. No burning bush appeared. No still small voice whispered comfort. Just the steady hum of the washing machine and the distant sound of my son and daughter-in-law discussing my inadequacies in the kitchen above. That night, sleep eluded me completely. I lay in the bed I'd shared with Harold for 35 years, staring at the ceiling while memories played like a broken film reel in my mind. Brandon learning to ride his bicycle in our driveway, his gap-toothed grin wide with pride when he finally managed to balance without my steadying hand. Brandon in his little suit for his first communion, so serious and reverent as he received the Eucharist. Brandon bringing Amanda home for the first time, his eyes bright with the kind of love I recognized because I'd felt it myself once. When had I become someone to be mocked? When had my presence transformed from comfort to burden? I pressed Harold's old pillow against my chest, breathing in the faint scent of his aftershave that still lingered despite the months since his passing, and wondered if this was what abandonment felt like. Not a sudden departure, but a slow erosion of respect and affection until nothing remained but obligation and embarrassment. Brandon and Amanda had been visiting more frequently lately, but their increased attention felt clinical rather than caring. They walked through my house with the appraising eyes of people conducting an inventory, noting which items might have value and which could be easily discarded. Last month, Brandon had casually asked if I'd updated my will since Dad passed, the question delivered with the forced casualness of someone trying to appear nonchalant about something that clearly mattered a great deal. Amanda had been even more direct, emailing me a list of lovely retirement communities with names like Golden Meadows and Sunset Manor, places where elderly people went to fade away quietly while their families resumed their lives unburdened by the inconvenience of aging parents. The brochures showed smiling seniors playing bingo and tending small gardens, but I saw through the cheerful marketing to the underlying message. This is where you go when your family decides you're no longer worth the effort of genuine love. They presented these options as gifts, opportunities for me to relax and enjoy my golden years, without the stress of maintaining a home or cooking for myself, as if the house where I'd built my life had become a prison instead of a sanctuary. As if the simple acts of daily living, preparing meals, tending my small garden, reading my Bible in the morning sunlight, had become burdens too heavy for a woman my age to bear. "You won't have to worry about anything, Mom," Brandon had said during his last visit, his tone the same one he'd used when explaining to his young children why they couldn't have ice cream for breakfast. "They'll take care of everything, your medications, your meals, even entertainment. You'll have friends your own age, friends my own age." As if friendship could be manufactured through proximity and shared circumstances, as if the deep bonds I'd formed through decades of church service and community involvement could be easily replaced by assigned companionship with strangers who happened to share my birth decade. But it was the smell comment that haunted me most, replaying in my mind during sleepless hours when the house felt too quiet and too large. I knew what they meant by medicine smell, the antiseptic scent of the ointments I used for my arthritis, the faint chemical odor of the prescription bottles that lined my bathroom counter like a pharmacy display, the lingering aroma of the heating pads and muscle relaxers that helped me manage the chronic pain that had become my constant companion. What they didn't understand, what they couldn't see beyond their own discomfort, was that every pill, every ointment, every medical aid represented my determination to remain independent, to continue caring for myself and others despite a body that had been worn down by decades of service. The medicine smell they mocked was the scent of resilience, of a woman refusing to surrender to the limitations that age and grief tried to impose. I thought of all the times I'd held Brandon when he was sick, rocking him through fevers and croup and childhood ailments without ever complaining about the smell of medicine or vomit or fear. I remembered the countless nights I'd sat beside Harold's hospital bed, breathing in the harsh antiseptic air of the cancer ward while holding his hand and praying for healing that never came. Had anyone ever suggested that I smelled like suffering then? Had anyone laughed at my dedication to the people I loved? As dawn approached and I finally gave up on sleep, I made my way to the kitchen and began my morning routine with mechanical precision. Coffee first, black and strong the way Harold had taught me to make it during our early years of marriage when money was tight and cream was a luxury. Then to my chair by the window where I read my daily scripture, the leather Bible soft and familiar in my hands, its pages marked with years of highlighting and note-taking in the margins. "Cast all your anxiety on him because he cares for you," I read from 1 Peter, my voice barely above a whisper in the empty kitchen. But the words felt hollow that morning, bouncing off the walls like echoes in an abandoned church. Did God really care about a 69-year-old widow whose own son saw her as an embarrassment? Did divine love extend to women who smelled like medicine and moved too slowly and remembered too much about times when they mattered? The morning light streamed through my kitchen window, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like tiny spirits, and I realized with crystalline clarity that something fundamental had shifted in my world. The casual cruelty of my son's laughter had awakened something in me. Not anger exactly, but a recognition that the life I'd been living was no longer sustainable. I was becoming invisible in my own existence, fading into the background of a story where I'd once been the protagonist. And for the first time in my 69 years, I began to wonder if perhaps it was time to write a different ending. The photo album lay open on my lap, its pages yellowed with age, each plastic sleeve protecting memories that now felt like evidence in a trial where I was both plaintiff and defendant. Brandon at 3 years old, chocolate cake smeared across his chubby cheeks during his birthday party, the same party where I'd spent 2 days baking from scratch because store-bought wasn't good enough for my miracle boy. Brandon at 8, proudly holding up a science fair trophy while I stood behind him, my hand on his shoulder, my smile wide with maternal pride and exhaustion from staying up until midnight helping him perfect his volcano project. But it was the photograph tucked between the pages that made my breath catch. A faded Polaroid of Harold, Brandon, and me standing in front of our old blue Chevrolet. Brandon couldn't have been more than 15, sullen and embarrassed as teenagers often are. But Harold's arm was around my waist and we were all smiling. On the back, in my careful handwriting, family trip to Mammoth Cave, 1998. Used grocery money for gas, but worth every penny to see Brandon's face light up in those caverns. I remembered that trip with painful clarity. We couldn't afford a real vacation. Harold's salary from the factory barely covered our mortgage, and Brandon's growing appetite for designer sneakers and name-brand clothes that would help him fit in with the wealthier kids at school. But I'd been saving quarters in a mason jar hidden behind the flour canister, skipping lunch most days and telling Harold I'd already eaten when he asked why I wasn't joining them at the dinner table. 3 months of hidden hunger had accumulated enough money for 2 tanks of gas and a cheap motel room with a leaky faucet and threadbare towels. Brandon had complained about the accommodations, the small pool, the vending machine sandwiches we ate instead of restaurant meals. But when we descended into those limestone caverns, and he saw the cathedral-like chambers carved by centuries of patient water, his teenage cynicism melted away, and he became my little boy again, reaching for my hand in the darkness, whispering "wow," with the reverence usually reserved for church. Harold had whispered in my ear as we watched Brandon explore, "You're the one who made this possible, Ellie. You always find a way to give him what he needs." I'd pressed my face against his shoulder to hide my tears, overwhelmed by gratitude for a husband who noticed my sacrifices, and a son who still, occasionally, let me see his wonder. That was before the cancer, before the medical bills that consumed our savings like a forest fire, before Harold's treatments made him so nauseous that the smell of cooking food sent him retching to the bathroom, leaving me to eat my solitary dinners standing at the kitchen counter, too heartbroken to sit at our table alone. Before the morphine made him forget my name, but remember, with startling clarity, the baseball statistics from his childhood. During those 10 years of Harold's illness, Brandon was building his life in Columbus. College, then his marketing job, then Amanda with her perfectly highlighted hair and her Instagram account full of restaurant meals that cost more than my weekly grocery budget. He visited dutifully, bringing flowers from the supermarket and staying just long enough to fulfill his obligations as a son, before retreating to his clean, uncomplicated life 2 hours away. "I don't know how you do it, Mom," he'd say, watching me adjust Harold's oxygen tubes or measure out his evening medications with the precision of a trained nurse. I could never handle all this medical stuff. Then he'd kiss my forehead and drive back to his apartment, leaving me alone with the machines that beeped through the night and the man I loved who was disappearing a little more each day. I never complained. When Brandon called to cancel visits because Amanda had planned weekend getaways, I said I understood. When he forgot Father's Day because he was swamped at work, I sent Harold a card from both of us and pretended it came from Brandon. When Christmas came and went without acknowledgement while Harold lay unconscious in the hospital bed we'd installed in our living room, I hung stockings anyway and sang carols to an audience of one dying man and several very expensive medical devices. "Cast your burden on the Lord, and he shall sustain you," I whispered during those dark nights, clutching my rosary while Harold's labored breathing filled the silence. "He shall never permit the righteous to be moved." But sometimes, in the deepest hours before dawn, I wondered if God was testing my faith or simply looking the other way while I learned exactly how much one woman could endure. The financial sacrifice was perhaps the most painful, though I never let Harold know how desperate our situation had become. His treatments weren't fully covered by insurance. Experimental therapies and specialist consultations that might buy us a few more months together came with price tags that made my stomach clench with anxiety. I mortgaged the house twice, cashed in Harold's modest retirement fund, and sold my mother's jewelry piece by piece to faceless buyers on the internet, who sent checks that barely covered another month of hope. Brandon knew none of this. When he asked how we were managing, I smiled and told him God provides, which was true in a sense. God had provided me with the strength to sacrifice everything for love. When Harold finally passed, peaceful and pain-free in his sleep on a Tuesday morning in March, I was holding his hand and whispering the 23rd Psalm, grateful beyond measure that he'd been spared any knowledge of the financial ruin his healing had cost. The funeral was beautiful, filled with Harold's co-workers and church friends who shared memories of his kindness and humor. Brandon delivered a eulogy that made everyone cry, speaking eloquently about his father's dedication to family and faith. Amanda wore an appropriate black dress and held Brandon's hand with the perfect combination of support and grief that suggested she'd researched proper funeral etiquette. But when the last casserole dish was returned and the sympathy cards stopped arriving, when the social worker from hospice made her final visit, and the medical equipment company retrieved their machines, Brandon's attention turned to practical matters with the efficiency of someone solving a problem rather than grieving a loss. "We need to talk about your finances, Mom," he said during his first post-funeral visit, spreading papers across my kitchen table with the authority of someone accustomed to managing complex situations. "I've been looking at Dad's accounts, and I'm concerned about your ability to maintain this house on just Social Security." I watched him review documents I'd hidden in Harold's desk, trying to shield my husband from the knowledge of our debt, even in death. Brandon's face grew more serious with each page, and I saw the exact moment when he calculated the magnitude of my financial sacrifice. But instead of gratitude or understanding, his expression shifted to something that looked almost like irritation. "Why didn't you tell me how bad things were?" he asked, not meeting my eyes. "I could have helped you make better decisions. Some of these treatments weren't even covered by Medicare. You spent our inheritance on experimental procedures that didn't even work." Our inheritance. Not Harold's life, not my desperate attempt to buy more time with the man I'd loved for 35 years, but their inheritance. The words hit me like a physical blow, revealing the calculation behind his concern and the transaction he'd apparently always seen in our relationship. "I did what love required," I said quietly, my voice steadier than my hands. "Your father needed those treatments. I needed to try everything possible. But at what cost?" Brandon continued, and I could see Amanda nodding approvingly behind him, her silence more supportive than words. "You're going to lose the house, Mom. You're going to end up in some government facility because you made emotional decisions instead of practical ones." That night, after they left with promises to research options and find solutions, I knelt beside my bed and prayed with a desperation that surprised me. "Lord, am I being tested or just forgotten?" The question escaped my lips before I could censor it. A moment of doubt that felt like blasphemy but tasted like truth. The silence that followed was complete. No whisper of divine comfort, no surge of peaceful assurance, just the settling sounds of an old house and the distant hum of a refrigerator that desperately needed repair. I stayed on my knees until my arthritis made standing an act of pure will, then climbed into bed still wearing my clothes, too exhausted by grief and revelation to care about proper nighttime routines. Over the following weeks, Brandon's visits became more frequent but less personal. He brought legal documents instead of flowers, discussed realistic planning instead of sharing memories, treated my home like a business asset requiring liquidation rather than the sanctuary where he'd grown from boy to man. He spoke to me with the patient tone usually reserved for elderly relatives whose judgment could no longer be trusted, explaining concepts like market value and assisted living facilities, as if I were a child learning vocabulary words. "The Golden Meadows place has an excellent reputation," he said during one particularly painful conversation. sliding a glossy brochure across my table with the same enthusiasm he might show for vacation destinations. They have craft activities, group meals, even a small chapel for services. You'd have friends your own age and professional staff to help with your medications. Professional staff to help with my medications. As if I hadn't been managing Harold's complex pharmaceutical regimen for years without error. As if I hadn't administered insulin injections and monitored blood pressure, and coordinated with multiple specialists while working part-time at the church office to help pay for treatments that would supposedly become our inheritance. I'm not ready for that yet, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. This house holds too many memories. I want to stay where I feel close to your father. Brandon exchanged a look with Amanda that spoke volumes about their patience with my sentimental attachments. Mom, you can't let emotions dictate major life decisions. Dad's gone. Holding on to this house isn't going to bring him back. It's just going to bankrupt you faster. Dad's gone. 3 words that reduced 35 years of marriage to past tense. Dismissed the love that had shaped every decision I'd made for over half my life. Harold wasn't just gone. He was present in every room of this house, in every photograph on every shelf, in the garden he'd planted, and the porch swing he'd built, and the kitchen where he'd kissed me goodbye every morning for decades. But Brandon saw only square footage and market potential, examining my grief-soaked sanctuary with the cold calculation of someone who'd already emotionally moved on. And as I watched him measure doorways and discuss staging strategies with Amanda, I realized with crushing clarity that I had become, in their eyes, simply another asset to be managed as efficiently as possible. That realization settled into my bones like arthritis, a permanent ache that prayer and time seemed powerless to heal. My 70th birthday came and went like any other Tuesday in October, marked only by the changing leaves outside my kitchen window and the silence that had become my most faithful companion. I'd circled the date in red ink on my calendar months earlier, the way I'd always done for special occasions. A small ritual of hope that someone might remember, might call, might acknowledge that Elaine Thompson had spent another year on this earth, and perhaps deserved recognition for the milestone. The phone never rang. I sat at my kitchen table that evening, staring at the single cupcake I'd bought for myself at the grocery store. Vanilla with pink frosting, the kind Brandon used to love when he was small enough to believe that birthday wishes still came true. The candle flickered in the draft from my poorly sealed windows, casting dancing shadows across Harold's empty chair. And I made a wish anyway. Please, God, let someone remember that I matter. I blew out the candle and ate the cupcake standing at the sink, throwing away the wrapper before sitting back down to face the reality that my only child had forgotten the day I was born. Not forgotten exactly. I knew Brandon had calendar notifications on his phone for everything important. He simply hadn't considered my birthday worthy of his attention, hadn't classified my continued existence as something requiring acknowledgement or celebration. 3 days later, Brandon called. Not to apologize for missing my birthday, but to inform me that he'd scheduled an appointment with a realtor to get a professional assessment of the property's potential. His voice carried the brisk efficiency of someone discussing a business transaction, not the tender consideration one might expect when dismantling their mother's life. I think you'll be pleasantly surprised by what the house might be worth in today's market, he said, and I could hear Amanda coaching him in the background, her voice a low murmur of encouragement as he delivered his rehearsed speech. With the right improvements in staging, we could probably get enough to set you up very comfortably in a nice facility. A nice facility. The phrase had become their euphemism for the institutional ending they'd decided was appropriate for my story. Not your new home, or a place where you'll be happy, just a facility, sterile and impersonal as the word itself, suggesting a place where inconvenient elderly people were processed rather than cherished. Brandon, I said, my voice catching slightly as I struggled to find words that might penetrate his business-like demeanor. This house isn't just property to me. This is where you took your first steps, where we said grace before every meal, where your father proposed to me on the front porch during that terrible snowstorm in 1985. Silence stretched across the phone line, filled only by the sound of paper shuffling and Amanda's continued whispered commentary. When Brandon finally responded, his tone had shifted to the patient condescension adults use with confused children. Mom, I understand this is emotional for you, but emotion can't pay mortgage bills or property taxes. You're living in the past, and the past doesn't have a sustainable financial model. Sustainable financial model. My son was discussing my grief using corporate terminology, reducing 35 years of marriage and motherhood to an economic equation that didn't balance properly in his spreadsheet. That Sunday, I attended Mass at St. Catherine's, the same church where Brandon had been baptized, confirmed, and married. I sat in our usual pew, third row from the front, left side, where Harold and I had worshipped together for decades, where we'd prayed for Brandon's health during his childhood illnesses, where we'd thanked God for the blessing of our small family. Father Miguel delivered a homily about the parable of the widow's mite, speaking about the woman who gave her last 2 coins while wealthy donors made grand public displays of their charity. His words felt personally directed, as if God was finally answering my prayers with a message about the value of sacrificial love versus material calculation. After the service, I lingered in the pew while other parishioners filed out, clutching my worn missal and trying to find comfort in the familiar ritual. Mrs. Patterson, a woman I'd served alongside at countless church suppers and charity drives, stopped beside me with what appeared to be genuine concern. "Elaine, dear, you look so thin. Are you eating enough? Are you taking care of yourself?" Her question was simple, but it was the first time in months that anyone had inquired about my well-being, rather than my real estate decisions. I wanted to tell her everything, about Brandon's calculating visits, about eating single-serving meals standing at my kitchen counter because sitting at the table alone felt too much like admitting defeat, about the nights I lay awake wondering if this was how all elderly parents eventually became burdens to the children they'd sacrificed everything to raise. Instead, I smiled and said, "I'm managing just fine, thank you," because admitting the truth would have required acknowledging that my son saw me as an obstacle to his financial planning, rather than a woman deserving of love and respect. Mrs. Patterson nodded, but something in her expression suggested she wasn't entirely convinced by my performance. She squeezed my hand with her arthritic fingers, hands that understood the daily battle against pain and limitation, and said quietly, "You know, sometimes managing and thriving are 2 very different things. If you ever need anything at all, you call me." That small gesture of human kindness nearly broke me completely. I nodded and hurried toward my car before my carefully maintained composure could crumble in front of the congregation that had watched me grow from young wife to grieving widow. The drive home took me past Brandon's old elementary school, where I'd volunteered countless hours as room mother and reading tutor, where I'd attended every parent conference and school play and science fair presentation with the dedication of someone who believed that showing up consistently was love made visible. The playground looked smaller than I remembered, the swing set where Brandon had played during recess now surrounded by updated safety equipment and modern conveniences that hadn't existed during his childhood. I pulled into the empty parking lot and sat in my car, staring at the building where my son had learned to read and write and think critically, skills I'd reinforced every evening at our kitchen table, helping him with homework assignments while dinner simmered on the stove and Harold watched the evening news. Those had been good years, when family felt like a team rather than a corporation, when my contributions were valued rather than calculated. My phone buzzed with a text message from Brandon. "Realtor coming Thursday at 2 p.m. Please make sure house is clean and organized. First impressions matter for property value." Not, "I hope this isn't too difficult for you," or, "Let me know if you need help preparing." Just instructions delivered with the expectation of compliance, treating me like an employee rather than the woman who'd given him life and devoted herself to his happiness. That evening, I found myself doing something I hadn't done since Harold's diagnosis. I questioned whether God was listening to my prayers or had simply decided that Elaine Thompson's suffering served some greater purpose I wasn't equipped to understand. I knelt beside my bed, rosary beads smooth and warm from decades of desperate handling, and asked the question that had been growing in my heart like a tumor. "Lord, am I being punished for something? Have I failed as a mother? As a wife? As a Christian?" The silence that answered me felt different than before, not empty, but heavy with possibility, as if the universe was holding its breath while I decided whether to accept my diminishing role or fight for something better. Thursday arrived with autumn rain that turned the fallen leaves into a slippery carpet across my front walkway. I spent the morning cleaning with an intensity born of desperation, scrubbing baseboards and polishing furniture, as if perfect housekeeping might somehow convince the realtor that I was competent to remain in my own home. My arthritis protested every movement, but I persisted, driven by the irrational hope that domestic perfection might buy me more time in the sanctuary Harold and I had built together. The realtor arrived precisely at 2 o'clock. A woman younger than Brandon with perfectly styled hair and clothes that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. She introduced herself as Jennifer, and immediately began photographing my living room with professional equipment, treating my personal space like a commercial property requiring documentation. "This is a lovely home," she said with practiced enthusiasm, her voice carrying the hollow brightness of someone skilled at delivering optimistic assessments. "With some strategic updates, new flooring, fresh paint, maybe modernize that kitchen. This could really appeal to young families looking for character properties." Character properties. My life's work reduced to real estate terminology. My carefully tended home dismissed as outdated infrastructure requiring improvement to meet contemporary standards. She measured rooms with electronic precision, made notes about dated fixtures and cosmetic challenges, and discussed market positioning, as if my domestic sanctuary was simply another commodity requiring proper packaging for sale. Brandon arrived halfway through the assessment, bringing Amanda and their efficiency expert approach to problem solving. They followed Jennifer through my house like prospective buyers rather than family members, pointing out flaws I'd learned to live with and suggesting improvements I couldn't afford to make. "The basement needs waterproofing," Amanda observed, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd watched enough home improvement shows to consider herself an expert. "And that kitchen is completely outdated. The appliances alone probably need replacing." I watched them inventory my inadequacies with mounting horror, realizing that my son was calculating the cost of erasing my presence from the space where I'd raised him. Every suggestion for improvement felt like criticism of my maintenance abilities. Every recommendation for modernization an indictment of my outdated existence. Jennifer concluded her assessment with a presentation of comparable sales and market projections, spreading glossy photographs across my kitchen table, while explaining how much money my displacement might generate. She spoke about motivated sellers and competitive pricing strategies, with the enthusiasm of someone discussing investment opportunities rather than the destruction of someone's final refuge. When they finally left, carrying their measurements and assessments and profit projections, I stood in my living room and saw it through their eyes for the first time, not as home, but as inventory requiring liquidation. The furniture Harold and I had chosen together during our early years of marriage suddenly looked shabby and outdated. The photographs covering every surface seemed excessive rather than sentimental. The worn patches in the carpet where we'd walked the same paths for decades appeared pathetic rather than familiar. That night, I dropped my favorite coffee mug, the one Harold had given me for Mother's Day 15 years earlier, painted with roses and the words, "World's Best Mom." It shattered against the kitchen floor with a sound that seemed to echo through the empty house, and I collapsed beside the broken pieces, finally allowing myself to cry with the abandon I'd been suppressing for months. As I knelt among the ceramic fragments, each shard reflecting the kitchen light like broken promises, I realized that my tears weren't just for the mug or the house, or even for Harold. I was mourning the version of myself that had believed unconditional love would be returned in kind, the woman who'd trusted that devotion and sacrifice would be rewarded with respect and gratitude rather than calculation and dismissal. For the first time in my 70 years, I began to wonder if perhaps God wasn't testing my faith. Perhaps he was preparing me to discover a strength I'd never needed before. The intervention, because that's what Brandon called it when he scheduled our family meeting, was set for the following Saturday at precisely 10 o'clock in the morning. He'd sent me a text message with the timing, as if my presence at a discussion about my own future was optional rather than essential, as if I were an employee being summoned to a performance review rather than a mother whose life they were dismantling piece by piece. I spent Friday night preparing for what felt like my own trial, laying out my best dress, the navy blue one with small flowers that Harold had always said brought out my eyes. and practicing the words I might use to defend my right to remain in my own home. But every argument I rehearsed sounded desperate even to my own ears. Every plea for understanding seemed to confirm their assessment that I was too emotional to make rational decisions about my future. The dress hung on my closet door like a flag of surrender, and I wondered if there was any point in trying to look dignified when the verdict had already been decided. Saturday morning arrived gray and drizzling, the kind of Toledo autumn weather that made everything feel mournful and inevitable. I made coffee with extra care, using Harold's favorite mug and adding cream the way he'd taught me during our early years of marriage, when such small rituals felt like acts of love rather than desperate attempts to maintain connection with ghosts. Brandon arrived 15 minutes early, bringing Amanda and a leather portfolio that suggested serious business would be conducted. But this time, they also brought Emma, their 8-year-old daughter, my granddaughter, whom I saw perhaps 4 times a year, and who had been taught to address me as Grandmother Thompson, rather than any of the warm, familiar titles that other grandmothers enjoyed. Emma sat quietly on my sofa, her small hands folded in her lap, her enormous dark eyes taking in the tension that filled my living room like smoke. She was a beautiful child, with Brandon's stubborn chin and Amanda's careful composure, but she'd been raised to observe rather than participate in adult conversations, trained to be seen but not heard when serious matters required discussion. Emma wanted to come, Amanda explained with the false brightness she used when presenting uncomfortable situations as opportunities for character development. We thought it would be good for her to understand what's happening with Grandmother Thompson's living situation. What's happening with Grandmother Thompson's living situation? As if I weren't sitting 3 feet away, as if my displacement was a learning experience for their daughter, rather than the destruction of everything I held dear. Brandon arranged his papers across my coffee table with the methodical precision of someone conducting a business meeting, transforming my living room into a conference space where my future would be decided by committee. The leather portfolio contained real estate listings, facility brochures, and financial projections that reduced my existence to columns of numbers and cost-benefit analyses. "Mom," he began, his voice carrying the practiced authority of someone who'd rehearsed this presentation, "we need to have a frank discussion about your options. The house assessment confirmed what we suspected. Maintaining this property isn't financially sustainable on your current income. Your current income. Social Security payments that barely covered utilities and groceries, the modest survivor benefits from Harold's factory pension that the cancer treatments had already decimated. They spoke about my poverty as if it were a personal failing, rather than the inevitable result of choosing love over financial security, of spending everything we had to buy time with a dying husband." Amanda opened one of the glossy brochures and spread it across the table where Harold and I had shared thousands of meals, where I'd helped Brandon with homework and listened to his childhood dreams about becoming a marine biologist or an astronaut or whatever profession had captured his imagination that particular week. "Sunset Manor has an excellent reputation," she said, pointing to photographs of elderly people playing cards and tending small gardens under the supervision of uniformed staff members. "They have 24-hour medical care, nutritious meal plans, and social activities designed specifically for people your age." People your age. The phrase carried implications about my declining capabilities and shrinking social relevance, suggesting that I'd reached a stage of life where meaningful relationships could only exist with others who shared my obsolescence. Emma shifted uncomfortably on the sofa, her young mind apparently processing the adult conversation in ways that made her fidget with anxiety. I wanted to reassure her that everything would be fine, but I wasn't certain that would be true, and I'd never believed in lying to children about serious matters. "The monthly cost is actually quite reasonable," Brandon continued, sliding financial projections across the table with the enthusiasm of someone who'd discovered an unexpected bargain. "When we factor in the sale price of the house minus realtor fees and necessary repairs, you'd have enough for approximately 18 months of care, maybe 2 years if we invest the remainder conservatively. 18 months. 2 years at most. The timeline of my remaining relevance calculated with actuarial precision, my death date estimated based on facility costs and investment returns. They were planning my final act as if it were a financial portfolio requiring careful management, rather than the conclusion of a life that had value beyond its economic productivity. "What happens after 2 years?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The question hung in the air like incense, heavy with implications none of us wanted to examine too closely. Brandon exchanged a look with Amanda, and I saw in that silent communication the conversation they'd already had in private, the decisions they'd made about my future without consulting the woman most affected by their planning. "Well," Brandon said carefully, "by then you'll qualify for Medicaid assistance. The state has programs for elderly care that will cover basic needs. Basic needs. Food, shelter, and medical maintenance. The minimum requirements for keeping elderly bodies functioning while their spirits slowly withered from neglect and institutional efficiency. Not comfort, not dignity, not the small luxuries that made life worth living, just survival in its most stripped-down form." Emma spoke for the first time since arriving, her small voice cutting through the adult pretense with the clarity that only children possess. "Why can't Grandmother Thompson just stay in her house? I like visiting here. It smells like cookies and flowers." The innocent question created a moment of uncomfortable silence, during which my granddaughter's simple logic exposed the heartlessness of their calculated compassion. Out of the mouths of babes, I thought, remembering the biblical verse about truth being revealed through children's uncomplicated understanding of right and wrong. "It's complicated, sweetheart," Amanda said, her voice taking on the patient tone adults use when explaining adult cruelty to children. "Grandmother Thompson's house is too big for her now, and she needs special help that we can't provide." Special help. As if my need for occasional assistance with heavy lifting or high shelves was evidence of complete incapacity rather than the normal adjustments that aging required. As if the woman who'd managed Harold's complex medical care for 10 years had suddenly become incompetent to manage her own basic needs. "But I could help her," Emma said with the generous spirit of childhood, unaware that her parents had already classified such assistance as impractical and inconvenient. "I could visit more often and help with cleaning and cooking. Mommy says I'm getting really good at making sandwiches." Her offer of help, sincere and unconditional in the way only children's love can be, brought tears to my eyes while simultaneously highlighting how far her parents had traveled from the simple generosity their daughter still possessed. Emma saw a grandmother who needed companionship and assistance. Her parents saw a liability requiring professional management. Brandon cleared his throat and returned to his presentation, apparently uncomfortable with the direction Emma's questions were leading. "The point is, Mom, we've found several excellent facilities that can provide the level of care you're going to need as you continue aging. This isn't just about finances. It's about safety and proper medical supervision." Proper medical supervision. I thought about the pills I organized each week in a 7-day dispenser, the blood pressure readings I recorded faithfully for my doctor, the physical therapy exercises I performed each morning to maintain mobility and independence. I'd been managing my own medical care with the same competence I'd brought to managing Harold's more complex needs, but they spoke as if I were one missed medication away from complete cognitive collapse. "I've been taking care of myself for 70 years, I said, finding my voice despite the tremor of emotion that threatened to undermine my authority. "I took care of your father through 10 years of cancer treatments, managed his medications, coordinated with specialists, made medical decisions that doctors respected. Why do you suddenly think I can't handle my own much simpler health needs?" The question created another uncomfortable pause during which Brandon and Amanda seemed to realize they'd based their arguments on assumptions about my incompetence rather than evidence of actual decline. But instead of reconsidering their position, they doubled down on their paternalistic concern. "It's not about what you've done in the past," Amanda said with the condescending kindness of someone explaining reality to a confused child. "It's about being proactive instead of waiting for a crisis. What happens if you fall and can't reach the phone? What if you have a medical emergency in the middle of the night? What if your memory starts to decline? What if? What if? What if?" They were arguing for the imprisonment of my present based on hypothetical future disasters, demanding that I surrender my independence as insurance against possibilities that might never occur. By their logic, anyone over 60 should be institutionalized as a precautionary measure against the crimes their bodies might someday commit against their dignity. Emma had been listening with the intense concentration children bring to adult conversations they sense are important but don't fully understand. Suddenly, she slipped off the sofa and came to sit beside me, her small hand finding mine with the unconscious comfort-giving instinct that adults seem to lose somewhere between childhood and the practical cruelty of middle age. "Grandmother Thompson," she said solemnly, "are you sad about leaving your house?" The question, asked with such direct compassion, broke through my carefully maintained composure. I squeezed her small fingers and felt tears threatening to betray the dignity I'd been trying to maintain throughout this entire ordeal. "Yes, sweetheart," I whispered. "This house holds all my memories of your grandfather and your daddy when he was little. It's where I feel closest to the people I love." Emma nodded with the grave understanding of someone who'd never had to choose between love and logistics. Someone who still believed that emotional attachment was sufficient reason to fight for what mattered. "Then you should stay," she announced with the absolute certainty of childhood logic. "People should live where they're happy." Brandon and Amanda exchanged another look, this one tinged with irritation at their daughter's interference in adult decision-making. I could see them calculating how to redirect the conversation away from Emma's inconvenient compassion and back to their practical concerns about liability and financial responsibility. "Emma, honey," Brandon said, his voice carrying the slight edge that suggested his patience was wearing thin. "Sometimes grown-ups have to make decisions that don't feel good, but are the right thing to do. Grandmother Thompson will be much safer and happier at Sunset Manor once she adjusts to her new situation. Grandmother Thompson will be much safer and happier." He spoke about my future emotional state with the confidence of someone who'd never spent a single night in institutional care, never experienced the particular loneliness of being surrounded by strangers paid to provide efficiency rather than affection. But it was Emma's response that finally crystallized something that had been building in my chest throughout this entire charade. She looked at her father with the disappointment that only innocent children can express when adults fail to meet their basic expectations of decency. "Daddy," she said quietly, "that's not what Jesus would do." The words hung in the air like a benediction, carrying more moral authority than all of Brandon's financial projections and Amanda's practical concerns combined. My 8-year-old granddaughter had identified the central issue with clarity that her parents seemed incapable of achieving. This wasn't a financial problem or a safety concern or a healthcare issue. This was a test of Christian love, and they were failing it spectacularly. For the first time since this ordeal began, I felt something other than despair rising in my chest. Emma's simple faith had reminded me of something I'd temporarily forgotten in my grief and confusion. I wasn't just a woman facing eviction from her home. I was a daughter of God who'd spent 70 years learning how to love sacrificially. And perhaps it was time to discover what strength looked like when it stopped apologizing for taking up space in the world. That night, after Brandon and Amanda had left with their defeated portfolio, and Emma's innocent words still echoing through my empty house, I did something I hadn't done in decades. I got angry at God. Not the polite, whispered disappointment I'd expressed during Harold's illness, or the quiet confusion I'd felt during months of my son's calculated cruelty. This was righteous anger, the kind that Moses must have felt when he saw the golden calf, the kind that Jesus experienced when he overturned the money changers' tables in the temple. I knelt beside my bed, clutching my rosary so tightly the beads left impressions in my palms, and I spoke to God with a directness that surprised me. "Lord, I have been faithful. I have been patient. I have turned the other cheek until my neck aches from the effort. But I cannot, I will not, let them reduce me to a problem requiring their solution." The words poured out like water breaking through a dam, carrying with them 70 years of accumulated silence and submission. "You gave me a mind, Lord. You gave me a heart capable of love, and a spirit that refuses to be broken by their calculations." Emma sees what they cannot. That this isn't about money or safety or convenience. This is about whether love means anything more than efficient disposal of inconvenient people. For the first time in months, the silence that followed my prayer felt different, not empty or accusatory, but pregnant with possibility, as if God was finally saying, "Now you're ready to hear what I've been trying to tell you." I slept better that night than I had since Harold's passing, and when I woke Sunday morning, Something fundamental had shifted in my understanding of my situation. I wasn't a victim of circumstances beyond my control. I was a woman with choices, and it was time to start making them intentionally, rather than simply enduring whatever my family decided was best for me. At Mass that morning, Father Miguel spoke about the parable of the talents, the servants who invested what they'd been given versus the one who buried his gift in the ground out of fear. His words seemed personally directed, as if God was using this gentle priest to remind me that survival wasn't the same as faithful stewardship of the life I'd been given. We are called not just to preserve what we've received, Father Miguel said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd witnessed both great faith and great failure, but to multiply it, to use it boldly in service of God's kingdom, even when the world tells us we're too old, too poor, too powerless to make a difference. After the service, I remained in my pew longer than usual, letting the other parishioners file out while I sat in the presence of the crucified Christ who hung above the altar. The corpus was carved from dark wood, its surface worn smooth by decades of faithful gazing, and I found myself studying the face of someone who'd also been written off by the authorities of his time, who'd also been told he was inconvenient and dangerous to the established order. "Jesus," I whispered. "Show me how to be faithful without being foolish. Show me how to love without enabling cruelty. Show me how to honor my son while refusing to let him dishonor me." The prayer felt different than my usual supplications. Less pleading, more partnership, as if I was finally ready to collaborate with God rather than simply wait for divine rescue that might never come. Monday morning, I did something that would have been unthinkable just days earlier. I called Brandon and told him I needed to speak with him alone, without Amanda, without portfolios, without predetermined solutions to problems he'd decided I represented. "I have something important to discuss," I said, my voice steadier than it had been in months. "Can you come by this evening after work? Just you?" The request seemed to surprise him, perhaps because it was the first time in our recent interactions that I'd initiated contact, rather than simply responding to his management of my crisis. "Is everything okay, Mom? Are you feeling sick? Do you need me to take you to the doctor?" His immediate assumption that I must be experiencing some kind of emergency revealed how thoroughly he'd categorized me as someone incapable of independent thought or action. The woman who'd raised him, who'd managed complex medical situations and household crises and financial challenges for decades, had become in his mind someone who only called when she needed rescue. "I'm fine," I said firmly. "I just need to talk with you about some decisions I've made." Decisions I've made? The phrase felt foreign in my mouth. When had I stopped being someone who made decisions and become someone who received them? When had my voice become advisory rather than authoritative in matters concerning my own life? Brandon arrived that evening looking slightly apprehensive, as if he suspected I might be planning to create complications for the efficient resolution of my housing situation. He sat across from me at the kitchen table where I'd fed him countless meals, helped him with homework, listened to his dreams and fears and adolescent dramas with the patient attention that mothers provide when they believe their children's concerns matter. "Brandon," I began, folding my hands on the table between us, "I need you to understand something that I don't think you've grasped during all these conversations about my future." He leaned forward slightly, his expression shifting into the patronizing concern I'd grown to recognize. The look adults give children who are about to say something they've already decided is unreasonable. "I am not a problem requiring your solution," I continued, my voice gaining strength with each word. "I am your mother, a woman who has lived 7 decades with intelligence and grace, who managed your father's care through 10 years of illness, who raised you to be the capable man you are today. I deserve better than to be treated like an inconvenient asset requiring liquidation." Brandon's mouth opened as if to interrupt, but I held up my hand with the authority of someone who'd spent years stopping classroom disruptions and settling household disputes. "I'm not finished," I said quietly. "I've listened to your concerns about finances and safety and practicality. Now you're going to listen to mine about dignity and autonomy and the right to determine my own future." Something in my tone must have convinced him that this conversation was different than our previous discussions, because he settled back in his chair with the wary attention of someone who'd suddenly realized they might have miscalculated the situation. I will not be moving to Sunset Manor or any other facility you've researched on my behalf, I announced. I will not be selling this house to fund your version of my appropriate retirement. I will not be managed like a declining stock portfolio that needs to be converted to more reliable investments. The words hung between us like a declaration of independence, and I watched Brandon process this unexpected resistance to his careful planning. His face cycled through surprise, confusion, and what looked like irritation that his mother was complicating his attempt to solve her life. "Mom, that's not realistic," he said finally, his voice carrying the exasperation of someone who'd thought this matter was settled. "We've been through the numbers. You can't afford to maintain this house on Social Security. You're going to end up losing everything if you don't make some hard decisions now." "You're right," I said, surprising him with my agreement. "I can't afford to maintain this house on my current income, but that doesn't mean your solution is the only option available." I reached into the drawer beside me and pulled out a folder I'd prepared earlier. Not leather and professional like Brandon's portfolio, but containing information I'd gathered through my own research and prayer and consultation with people who saw me as more than a problem requiring management. "I've spoken with Father Miguel about the church's ministry to elderly parishioners," I said, opening the folder to reveal brochures and contact information I'd collected. "There's a Catholic organization that helps seniors navigate housing options that don't require surrendering their independence or dignity." Brandon's expression shifted to something that looked almost like alarm, as if he'd suddenly realized that his careful control of my situation might be slipping away from him. "I've also contacted legal aid about my rights as a homeowner facing financial hardship," I continued, pulling out another set of documents. "There are programs available for people in my situation: reverse mortgages, property tax deferrals, utility assistance programs that might allow me to remain in my home while managing the financial challenges." "Mom, those programs are complicated," Brandon said, his voice taking on the urgent tone of someone who sensed his authority being challenged. "You don't understand all the legal implications and financial risks involved. You could end up in much worse shape if you don't handle these things properly." "Then help me understand them," I said simply. "Instead of deciding what's best for me, help me explore all my options so I can make an informed decision about my own life." The request seemed to catch him off guard, as if the possibility of involving me in decisions about my future was a novel concept requiring careful consideration. "And if I determine that institutional care is eventually necessary," I continued, "then I'll make that choice myself, when I'm ready, based on my own assessment of my needs rather than your assessment of my inadequacies." Brandon sat in silence for several moments, apparently processing this unexpected assertion of maternal authority. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost some of its patronizing edge. "I don't understand why you're making this so difficult," he said. "I'm trying to help you. I'm trying to make sure you're safe and taken care of." "I know you are," I said, and for the first time in months, I meant it. "But help looks different than control. Love looks different than management. And taking care of me doesn't mean making decisions for me. It means supporting me while I make my own decisions." That night, after Brandon left with promises to think about what I'd said, I sat in Harold's chair and opened my Bible to a passage I'd marked years earlier during a particularly difficult period of our marriage. The words of Proverbs 31 seemed to glow in the lamplight. "She is clothed with strength and dignity. She can laugh at the days to come." Strength and dignity. Not submission and gratitude for whatever crumbs of respect others chose to offer, but the confident expectation that a woman of 70 years had earned the right to determine her own future. I made myself a cup of tea, the real kind, loose leaves steeped in Harold's favorite mug, and sat at my kitchen table planning the next phase of my life with the same careful attention I'd once brought to raising my son and caring for my husband. But this time, I was planning for myself, with the radical understanding that self-care wasn't selfish when it meant refusing to be diminished by people who'd forgotten that respect wasn't something elderly women had to earn, but something they deserved simply by virtue of having survived 7 decades with their souls intact. For the first time since Harold's death, I went to bed that night feeling like a woman with a future, rather than a problem awaiting resolution. The house felt different around me, not like a burden I couldn't manage, but like a sanctuary I had every right to defend. And in my dreams, I heard Emma's voice again. That's not what Jesus would do. But this time, instead of condemnation for Brandon and Amanda, the words felt like encouragement for me. Permission to follow my granddaughter's moral clarity instead of accepting the world's practical cruelty. When morning came, I would begin the work of rebuilding my life according to my own understanding of what faithfulness looked like at 70 years old. Not surrender disguised as wisdom, but courage dressed in the dignity that no one could take from me unless I chose to give it away. Brandon's reaction to my newfound independence came swiftly and with the intensity that revealed just how deeply my resistance had threatened his sense of control. 3 days after our kitchen table conversation, he arrived at my house unannounced, bringing Amanda and a man I'd never seen before, someone in an expensive suit who introduced himself as a family counselor who specializes in elderly care transitions. I was in my garden when they arrived, kneeling among the chrysanthemums Harold had planted the year before his diagnosis, pulling weeds with the methodical patience that 70 years of life had taught me. My hands were dirty, my old gardening dress stained with soil, and I'm sure I looked exactly like the confused elderly woman they'd decided I was, someone who needed professional intervention to understand her own limitations. "Mom," Brandon called from the back porch, his voice carrying the forced cheerfulness of someone delivering unwelcome news. "We brought someone to talk with you about your options. Dr. Harrison specializes in helping families navigate difficult transitions." Dr. Harrison, not "we'd like you to meet someone," or "would you be willing to speak with a counselor," but the fait accompli of professional assessment delivered without my consent or consultation. They'd decided I needed evaluation, so evaluation would occur, regardless of my preferences in the matter. I stood slowly, my arthritic knees protesting the transition from kneeling to standing, and wiped my hands on the gardening apron that had belonged to Harold's mother. Another small inheritance from a woman who'd understood that dignity could be maintained even while working with soil and plants. The three of them watched my careful movements with the clinical attention of people assessing evidence of decline, noting every small struggle as confirmation of their predetermined conclusions. "I wasn't expecting company," I said, my voice calm despite the anger beginning to build in my chest. "If you wanted me to meet with someone, you should have asked if I was interested rather than simply arranging it without my knowledge." Dr. Harrison stepped forward with the practiced smoothness of someone accustomed to managing resistant elderly patients. He was perhaps 50 years old, with silver hair and the kind of confident demeanor that suggested he'd successfully convinced many families that his professional judgment superseded personal preferences. "Mrs. Thompson, I understand this feels intrusive," he said, his tone carrying the patronizing kindness that medical professionals often used when addressing people they'd already decided were cognitively compromised. "But your family is concerned about your ability to make sound decisions regarding your living situation. Sometimes an objective third party can help clarify what's truly in everyone's best interest." Everyone's best interest. The phrase revealed everything about how this intervention had been framed in their planning sessions, not as something designed to help me, but as something necessary to protect their interests from my stubborn refusal to cooperate with their solutions. "My decision-making ability?" I said, my voice growing sharper. "The same decision-making ability that managed Harold's complex medical care for 10 years? The same judgment that raised a successful son and maintained a household and contributed to my community for 7 decades? When exactly did you determine that I'd become incompetent?" Amanda shifted uncomfortably, apparently recognizing that their surprise intervention wasn't proceeding as smoothly as they'd anticipated. Dr. Harrison, however, maintained his professional composure, pulling out a clipboard with forms that suggested this assessment had been planned with considerable detail. "Mrs. Thompson, no one is questioning your past capabilities," he said, his voice taking on the patient explanatory tone used with confused children. "But age-related cognitive changes can affect judgment in ways that aren't always apparent to the person experiencing them. Your family has shared some concerns about recent decisions that suggest you might benefit from professional guidance. Recent decisions that suggest I might benefit from professional guidance. They'd pathologized my refusal to surrender my autonomy, transformed my resistance to their management into evidence of mental decline requiring expert intervention." "What recent decisions?" I asked, looking directly at Brandon. The decision to research my own housing options? The decision to consult with legal professionals about my rights? The decision to insist on being included in conversations about my own future? Brandon avoided my eyes, apparently uncomfortable with having his concerns articulated so directly. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the defensive tone of someone who'd been caught misrepresenting a situation. "Mom, you're being unrealistic about your financial situation," he said. "You're refusing to accept professional advice about the best ways to handle your housing crisis. That kind of rigid thinking can be a sign of changes that you might not recognize yourself. Changes that you might not recognize yourself. The clinical language of diminished capacity. The suggestion that my insistence on self-determination was actually evidence of cognitive impairment requiring their intervention. Dr. Harrison nodded approvingly, apparently pleased with Brandon's presentation of the situation. Denial and resistance to necessary changes are very common in early-stage cognitive decline, he said, making notes on his clipboard as if my fate was being documented in real time. Family members often notice these patterns before the individual does. "Would Jesus forgive this too?" I asked quietly, the question emerging from someplace deep in my chest where my faith intersected with my indignation. Should I forgive this manipulation disguised as concern? The religious reference seemed to catch all three of them off guard, as if they hadn't expected their intervention to encounter spiritual resistance. Dr. Harrison's professional composure wavered slightly, apparently unused to having his clinical authority challenged by appeals to divine judgment. "Mrs. Thompson, I understand that faith is important to you," he said carefully. "But sometimes religious thinking can prevent people from accepting practical realities. We need to focus on concrete steps that will ensure your safety and well-being. Religious thinking that prevents people from accepting practical realities." He'd just dismissed my Christian faith as a cognitive impediment to rational decision-making, reducing 7 decades of spiritual practice to an obstacle requiring professional management. That was the moment something crystallized in my understanding of what was happening in my own living room. This wasn't an intervention designed to help me. It was an ambush intended to break down my resistance through professional intimidation and family pressure. "I want all of you to leave," I said, my voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who'd reached the absolute limit of their tolerance for disrespect. "Now." Dr. Harrison looked genuinely surprised, apparently unaccustomed to having his services rejected so directly. "Mrs. Thompson, I think if you just give me a few minutes to explain the assessment process." "No," I said, standing straighter despite my 70-year-old spine's protest. "I did not consent to this assessment. I did not request your professional opinion. I did not invite you into my home to evaluate my mental competence. You are leaving now, or I'm calling the police to report trespassing." Brandon stepped forward, his face flushing with embarrassment and anger. "Mom, you're being completely unreasonable. Dr. Harrison drove all the way here to help you understand your situation better. The least you can do is listen to what he has to say." "I understand my situation perfectly," I said, my voice growing stronger with each word. "I understand that my son is so uncomfortable with my refusal to be managed by him that he's brought a stranger into my home to declare me mentally incompetent. I understand that you've decided my autonomy is less important than your convenience. I understand that you're trying to use professional authority to bully me into compliance." The accuracy of my assessment seemed to shock them into momentary silence. Dr. Harrison recovered first, apparently recognizing that his intervention had failed to achieve its intended purpose. "Mrs. Thompson, I can see that you're feeling overwhelmed," he said, his voice shifting to the soothing tone used with agitated patience. "Perhaps we should schedule this conversation for another time when you're feeling more receptive to professional guidance." "There will be no other time," I said firmly. "There will be no scheduled conversations about my mental competence with professionals I didn't choose and don't want to see. If my family cannot treat me with the respect due to a woman who has lived faithfully for 70 years, then perhaps they need to examine their own judgment rather than questioning mine." Amanda spoke for the first time since the confrontation began, her voice tight with frustration. "Elaine, you're making this so much harder than it needs to be. We're trying to help you avoid a crisis. We're trying to be responsible about your future care needs." You're trying to be responsible about your future obligations, I corrected her. You're trying to manage me like a liability requiring efficient disposal rather than a person deserving of love and respect. The word love seemed to hit Brandon like a physical blow. For a moment, his professional composure cracked, and I saw something that looked like the boy I'd raised, confused, hurt, and perhaps beginning to understand the magnitude of what he'd lost in his pursuit of efficient solutions. "Mom, I do love you," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "That's why I'm trying to make sure you're safe and taken care of. Love doesn't bring strangers into my home to evaluate my sanity," I said quietly. "Love doesn't pathologize my desire to remain independent. Love doesn't treat me like a problem requiring professional intervention." I walked to my front door and opened it wide, the autumn air rushing into my living room like a cleansing breath. Love respects my dignity even when it's inconvenient. Love trusts my judgment even when it conflicts with your preferences. Love supports my choices even when they complicate your plans. Dr. Harrison gathered his clipboard and forms with the efficiency of someone accustomed to unsuccessful interventions. As he passed me at the door, he paused and spoke quietly enough that Brandon and Amanda couldn't hear. "For what it's worth, Mrs. Thompson, you seem perfectly competent to make your own decisions. Your family might benefit from counseling about accepting their changing roles in your life." The comment surprised me with its honesty, and I found myself nodding in acknowledgement of his professional assessment, the first one that had actually been offered in my interest rather than in service of my family's anxiety. After they left, I stood in my empty living room and felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Complete peace. Not the false calm of surrender or the temporary relief of delayed conflict, but the deep satisfaction of someone who'd stood up for their own dignity against overwhelming pressure to capitulate. I made myself a cup of tea and sat in Harold's chair, opening my Bible to the passage that had sustained me through his illness and my subsequent grief. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. He restores my soul." Not through passive acceptance of mistreatment disguised as care, but through the courage to insist that my life had value beyond my utility to others, that my choices mattered beyond their convenience for my family. That evening, I did something I hadn't done since Harold's death. I called my neighbor Mrs. Patterson and invited her for coffee. Not because I needed help or rescue or professional intervention, but because I wanted company, the simple human connection that comes from choosing to share time with someone who sees you as worthy of friendship rather than management. "Elaine, dear," she said when she arrived with homemade cookies and genuine warmth, "you sound different. Stronger somehow." "I feel different," I admitted, pouring coffee into Harold's best china cups. "I feel like myself again for the first time in months." We talked until well past sunset, sharing stories about our late husbands, our complicated relationships with adult children, our fears about aging in a world that seemed to have little patience for elderly women who refused to become invisible. When she left, Mrs. Patterson hugged me with the fierce affection of someone who recognized a kindred spirit. "Don't let them wear you down," she whispered. "Don't let them convince you that wanting dignity is the same as being difficult." That night, I prayed with gratitude instead of desperation, thanking God for the strength to defend the life he'd given me against people who'd forgotten that love looked like respect, not management. For the first time since this ordeal began, I felt ready for whatever came next. Not because I was certain of the outcome, but because I was finally certain of my own worth. The morning after I reclaimed my dignity felt like Easter Sunday. Not because everything had been magically restored, but because something dead inside me had risen to new life. I woke before dawn without the crushing weight of anxiety that had been my alarm clock for months, and for the first time since Harold's passing, I felt genuinely curious about what the day might bring. I made coffee in Harold's favorite mug, not out of desperate nostalgia, but as a gentle acknowledgement of love that continued beyond physical presence. Then I did something I hadn't done in years. I opened all the curtains in my house, letting the November morning light stream across surfaces I'd grown accustomed to keeping in protective shadow. The phone rang at precisely 8 o'clock. Brandon, undoubtedly calling to continue yesterday's argument with whatever strategy he and Amanda had devised during their evening of damage control. I let it ring 4 times before answering, a small assertion of control that felt surprisingly empowering. "Mom." His voice carried the strained patience of someone who'd spent considerable time crafting his approach. "I think we got off on the wrong foot yesterday. Amanda and I were talking, and we realized maybe we came on too strong with Dr. Harrison. Too strong. As if the problem had been their methodology, rather than their fundamental assumption that I needed professional evaluation to validate my right to self-determination. "Brandon," I said, my voice calm but firm, "I'm glad you're recognizing that bringing a stranger to assess my mental competence was inappropriate. But I need you to understand that this isn't about your approach. It's about your entire premise." Silence stretched across the phone line, punctuated only by the faint sound of traffic in the background that suggested he was calling from his car, probably on his way to work where problems had straightforward solutions, and people followed reasonable management protocols. "I don't need to be managed," I continued. "I need to be respected. I don't need to be rescued from my own decisions. I need to be supported while I make them. Can you understand the difference?" "I'm trying to, Mom," he said, and something in his voice suggested he might actually mean it. "It's just, I worry about you being alone in that big house. I worry about what happens if you fall or get sick or can't manage things the way you used to." His concern sounded genuine for the first time in months, stripped of the calculating practicality that had characterized our recent conversations. Perhaps Dr. Harrison's failed intervention had forced him to examine his own motivations more honestly. "I worry about those things too," I admitted. "But worry doesn't give you the right to make my decisions for me. It gives you the opportunity to help me prepare for possibilities while respecting my autonomy." After we hung up, I did something that would have been unthinkable just days earlier. I called Father Miguel and asked if the church needed volunteers for any programs serving elderly parishioners. Not because I needed to be served, but because I had experience and wisdom to offer from the perspective of someone who'd successfully navigated the challenges they were facing. "Mrs. Thompson," Father Miguel said, his voice carrying the warmth that had made him beloved by our parish community. "What a wonderful surprise to hear from you. Actually, we've been praying about starting a support group for widows and widowers, people who are learning to rebuild their lives after losing their spouses. Would you be interested in helping us develop something like that?" Helping develop something. Not just participating or receiving services, but contributing my experience to create resources for others facing similar transitions. The invitation felt like recognition of my value rather than acknowledgement of my need. "I would be honored," I said, meaning it completely. "I've learned some things about grief and resilience that might help others who are walking this path." That afternoon, I drove to the church for my first planning meeting, and for the first time in months, I felt like I was going somewhere rather than simply getting through another day. The November air was crisp and clean, carrying the promise of winter's clarity rather than the oppressive weight of endings I'd been feeling since Harold's death. The meeting included Father Miguel, 2 other recently widowed women, and Maria Santos, the parish social worker who coordinated outreach programs with the practical wisdom of someone who'd seen both miracles and disasters in equal measure. We sat in the church library, surrounded by theological texts and inspirational biographies, planning a ministry that would address the specific challenges of rebuilding identity after losing the person who'd helped define it for decades. "The goal isn't to get over grief," Maria explained as we discussed potential group topics, "but to learn how to carry it gracefully while discovering who you are beyond the role of caretaker and companion. Who you are beyond the role of caretaker and companion." The phrase resonated with something deep in my chest, suggesting possibilities I hadn't considered during months of being reduced to my limitations rather than recognized for my remaining potential. "I'd like to lead a session on financial planning for seniors," I said, surprising myself with the offer. Not because I'm an expert, but because I've learned what questions to ask and what resources are available for people who find themselves in challenging situations. The other women nodded enthusiastically, apparently recognizing the value of practical wisdom shared by someone who'd actually navigated the complex bureaucracy of Social Security, Medicare, and legal aid services, rather than someone who'd simply studied them academically. Over the following weeks, I threw myself into developing our widow's support ministry with the energy I'd once devoted to raising Brandon and caring for Harold. But this time, the energy came from a different source. Not desperate love trying to earn recognition, but purposeful service flowing from my own sense of worth and calling. I researched grief counseling techniques, legal resources for elderly women, and financial assistance programs with the methodical attention I'd once brought to managing Harold's medical care. But instead of feeling drained by the responsibility, I felt energized by the opportunity to transform my suffering into service for others facing similar challenges. The first meeting of our group drew 12 women, ages ranging from 55 to 83, each carrying their own story of loss and confusion about how to rebuild life after the person who'd been their primary relationship disappeared. We met in the church fellowship hall, surrounded by the warm acoustics of a space designed for community, rather than the clinical atmosphere of professional therapeutic settings. "I don't know who I am anymore," confessed Margaret, a woman my age whose husband had died after 52 years of marriage. For half a century, I was Tom's wife. Now, I'm just nobody. Her words captured what every woman in that circle had experienced. The peculiar grief of losing not just a person but an identity, not just a relationship but a role that had shaped every decision and defined every day for decades. "You're not nobody," I said gently, recognizing myself in her confusion. "You're someone who loved so deeply that your identity became intertwined with service to another person. That's not a weakness to overcome. It's a strength to redirect." Over the months that followed, our group became more than a support circle. It became a community of women discovering that their caregiving skills, their patience with difficult personalities, their ability to manage complex medical and financial situations, their capacity for sacrificial love, were all valuable assets rather than outdated capabilities. Some of the women found part-time employment using skills they'd developed during decades of household management. Others discovered volunteer opportunities that utilized their experience with medical bureaucracy and family crisis management. Several found the courage to set boundaries with adult children who'd begun treating them as problems requiring solutions rather than people deserving respect. I found myself becoming something I'd never imagined. A mentor to women who needed to hear from someone who'd survived the transition from useful family member to autonomous individual without losing her faith or her sense of purpose. "Mrs. Thompson," said Elena, a recently widowed woman whose children lived across the country and rarely called, "how do you keep from being bitter? How do you keep believing that God cares about elderly women when the world seems so ready to discard us?" The question touched the core of everything I'd been wrestling with since Harold's death. How did faith survive when prayers seemed unanswered? How did trust in God's love persist when human love proved so conditional and calculating? "I think," I said slowly, "that God doesn't see us as elderly women. God sees us as his daughters who happen to have lived long enough to accumulate wisdom worth sharing. Our age isn't a limitation. It's an achievement. Our experience isn't outdated. It's irreplaceable." The words surprised me even as I spoke them, revealing an understanding I hadn't consciously developed, but had apparently been growing during months of struggle and prayer and gradual awakening to my own worth. One snowy evening in December, as I was preparing for bed after another successful group meeting, my phone rang with an unexpected call. Emma's small voice came through the speaker, apparently calling from her parents' bedroom while they were downstairs. "Grandmother Thompson," she whispered, "I miss you. Mommy and Daddy are sad all the time now, and they keep talking about how they made mistakes. Will you come to my Christmas play at school?" The invitation hit me like grace. Unexpected, unearned, and absolutely precious. Emma had reached across the gulf that my conflict with her parents had created, offering the simple gift of a child's uncomplicated love. "I would be honored to attend your Christmas play," I told her, meaning it with every fiber of my being. "What time should I be there?" That night, I prayed with gratitude that felt like sunlight after months of shadow. Not because my family situation had been magically resolved, but because I'd discovered something more important than their approval. I'd found my own calling, my own community, my own purpose that didn't depend on anyone else's validation. I was no longer waiting for my life to be restored to what it had been. I was actively building something new, something that honored both my past service and my future potential, something that placed God at the center rather than trying to earn his attention through perfect submission to other people's expectations. For the first time since Harold's death, I fell asleep excited about tomorrow, not because I knew what it would bring, but because I finally trusted my own ability to handle whatever came with grace, wisdom, and the kind of faith that creates rather than simply endures. The woman who'd been mocked for smelling like medicine had become someone who offered healing to others. And in that transformation, I finally understood what Jesus meant when he promised that those who lose their life for his sake would find it. I had lost my old life completely, but in its place, I'd found something far more valuable: the knowledge that my worth wasn't determined by my utility to others, but by my willingness to serve God through using the gifts he'd given me, including the gift of hard-won wisdom about how to rebuild hope from the ashes of disappointment. 6 months after I stopped allowing myself to be managed like an inconvenient problem, I stood in the fellowship hall of St. Catherine's Church, watching 23 women celebrate the graduation of our first official Widows of Strength support program. The room buzzed with laughter and conversation, not the careful politeness of people trying to avoid difficult topics, but the genuine joy of women who'd rediscovered their own worth after being told they were past their expiration date. Margaret, the woman who'd once described herself as nobody after 52 years of marriage, was showing photos of the small business she'd started selling homemade preserves at the farmer's market. Elena, whose distant children rarely called, had become a reading tutor at the elementary school where her gentle patience was transforming struggling students into confident learners. Sarah, the youngest member of our group at 55, had enrolled in community college to pursue the nursing degree she'd abandoned decades earlier to raise her family. Each success story represented more than personal recovery. They were testimonies to the truth that had taken me 70 years to fully understand. Women don't become invisible after their primary relationships end. They simply become free to discover who they were meant to be beyond the roles others had assigned them. Emma's Christmas play had been the turning point I hadn't dared to hope for. When I arrived at the elementary school auditorium that cold December evening, I found Brandon and Amanda saving me a seat in the front row, not out of obligation, but with what appeared to be genuine desire for my presence. Emma's face had lit up like the Star of Bethlehem when she spotted me in the audience, and her enthusiastic wave from the stage had drawn smiles from other parents who recognized the pure joy of a child whose grandmother had chosen to show up. After the performance, as we stood in the lobby watching Emma accept compliments on her portrayal of the angel Gabriel, Brandon had approached me with an expression I hadn't seen since his childhood. Uncertainty mixed with hope, the look of someone who wanted to repair something important but wasn't certain how to begin. "Mom," he'd said quietly, "I owe you an apology. Several apologies, actually. I've been so focused on trying to solve your problems that I forgot to ask if you actually considered them problems." The admission had surprised me with its honesty, suggesting that the months of conflict had prompted genuine self-reflection rather than simply strategic recalculation of his approach. "I was scared," he'd continued, his voice barely audible above the chattering families around us. "Scared of losing you the way we lost Dad. Scared of making the wrong decisions. Scared of being responsible for something terrible happening to you. But I realize now that trying to protect you from every possible risk meant taking away your right to live the life you chose." Amanda had nodded in agreement, her expression carrying the humility of someone who'd recognized an error in judgment significant enough to require genuine change rather than surface apology. "We'd like to start over," she'd said. "Not with managing your decisions, but with supporting whatever you decide. Can you teach us how to do that?" The request had moved me to tears, not because I'd finally received the apology I'd been hoping for, but because my son and daughter-in-law were asking me to teach them something I'd only recently learned myself: how to love someone without trying to control them. Over the months that followed, our family relationships had slowly transformed from management structure to mutual support system. Brandon began calling not to check on my decision-making capacity, but to ask about my work with the Widows Group, and to share updates about his own life that didn't revolve around my perceived inadequacies. Amanda started including me in their family activities, not as a duty to be discharged, but as a grandmother whose presence added value to their gatherings. Most importantly, Emma and I had developed the kind of relationship I'd always dreamed of having with a granddaughter. One built on shared activities and genuine affection rather than formal obligation. She spent Saturday afternoons at my house learning to bake cookies from Harold's mother's recipes, listening to stories about her grandfather's youth, and helping me tend the garden that had become a symbol of life continuing beyond loss. On this particular evening, as I watched the women of our support group celebrate their achievements, I felt Harold's presence in a way I hadn't experienced since his death, not as painful absence, but as continuing love that had shaped me into someone capable of helping others heal. He would have been proud of what had grown from the ashes of my grief, proud of the woman I'd become when I stopped trying to earn love through submission and started offering it through service. Mrs. Thompson, said Maria Santos, the parish social worker who'd helped birth our ministry, I have news that might interest you. The diocese wants to replicate our program in parishes throughout Ohio. They're asking if you'd be willing to travel as a consultant, helping other churches develop similar ministries for elderly women. The invitation represented possibilities I couldn't have imagined during those dark months when I'd felt invisible and useless. Travel, new communities, the chance to use my hard-won wisdom to help establish support systems for women facing the same dismissive attitudes I'd encountered from my own family. I'd be honored, I said, meaning it completely, but I want to continue leading our group here too. This is home. Home. The word carried different meaning now than it had when I'd fought so desperately to remain in Harold's house. Home wasn't just the building where I'd lived for decades. It was the community I'd helped create, the relationships I'd built through service, the sense of purpose that came from knowing my presence mattered beyond my utility to others. That night, I sat in Harold's chair reading the evening prayers. But instead of the desperate supplications that had characterized my spiritual life during the crisis, I found myself offering gratitude for the unexpected ways God had answered prayers I hadn't even known how to pray. I'd asked for my family to recognize my worth. Instead, I'd learned to recognize it myself. I'd prayed for restoration of my old life. Instead, I'd been given the strength to build a new one. I'd begged for rescue from loneliness. Instead, I'd discovered how to transform isolation into solitude, desperation into service, suffering into wisdom that could heal others. The house around me felt different too, not smaller or emptier than when Harold was alive, but purposeful in new ways. The kitchen where I'd once cooked elaborate meals for a family of 3 now served as headquarters for preparing simple refreshments for support group meetings. The living room where we'd once watched television together had become a space for one-on-one conversations with women learning to rebuild their identities after loss. Even my appearance had changed in ways that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with self-respect. I'd started wearing colors again, the deep blues and warm purples that Harold had always said brought out my eyes. I'd invested in a good haircut, not to impress anyone, but because I'd remembered that caring for myself was an act of stewardship rather than vanity. The medicine smell that Brandon had mocked so cruelly had been replaced by the sense of living. Fresh flowers from my garden, coffee brewing for unexpected guests. The lavender sachets I tucked into care packages for women in our program who were struggling with depression or anxiety. As I prepared for bed that night, I caught my reflection in the bathroom mirror and saw someone I barely recognized. Not because I looked younger, but because I looked purposeful. My face showed the lines that 70 years of living had earned. But they were good lines. Laugh lines, worry lines that spoke of a woman who'd cared deeply about people and causes worth the cost of caring. I opened my Bible to a passage that had sustained me through the darkest periods of this journey. Weeping may endure for a night, but joy comes in the morning. The morning had indeed come, not as restoration of what I'd lost, but as recognition of what I'd gained through the process of losing everything that hadn't actually belonged to me anyway. Standing at my bedroom window, looking out at the garden where Harold's plants continued to bloom under my care, I whispered a prayer of gratitude for the unexpected gift of becoming myself at 70 years old. Not the diminished version of who I'd been, but the amplified version of who I'd always been meant to be. The journey from medicine-scented burden to purposeful woman had required losing everything I'd thought defined me. But in that stripping away, I'd discovered the truth that had been waiting underneath all along. I was beloved by God, not because of what I did for others, but because of who I was as His daughter. And tomorrow I would wake up and continue the work of helping other women discover that same liberating truth, that their worth wasn't determined by their usefulness to families who'd forgotten how to see them, but by their willingness to answer God's call to serve with the wisdom only suffering could teach. Have you ever experienced something like this, or known someone who found strength through their faith when family failed them? Please share in the comments how faith helped you or someone you love find dignity again. If this story touched your heart, please leave a like and subscribe to this channel so this message can reach someone who needs to hear it today. May God bless everyone who's been through something like this. In Jesus' name, amen.